This is our subject for a quick, real-time, 30-minute line drawing. It's a very typical street in Edinburgh, winding down the hill, relatively narrow streets with these incredible stone facade buildings on both sides, creating great contrast of sunlight and shadow, and with the castle on top of the hill looming over the whole scene. And so I want to capture these elements, while of course this drawing is sped up. The line work took 30 minutes, and the tone that I splashed on afterwards, maybe another 7 or 8 or so. In my mind, this is a good speed for location sketching, which I hope to get the chance to do in Edinburgh again one day. Let's draw. Well, here's my starting time. So I start with the left-hand side, and I want to establish really a sense of scale for the rest of the drawing. I don't start with the figures down the front. The ground level is very cluttered, so I want to start a bit higher up where it's more straightforward, and then I can use that to align what's happening down at street level. I work at getting these buildings as accurate as I can, but I do make a fundamental mistake. As I do these buildings, I actually draw the windows and then put the end of the building in place. And what that means is I don't tighten the windows enough, and so the buildings end up just a bit wide. So they come further across the paper than they should. What I should have done is to, especially on such a small scale, is to draw the end of the building and then fit the windows into that. That would have been a better way to manage the scale in this particular instance. I'm using a 0.5 pen for this fine liner because I want these buildings to feel closer. So I want a heavier line, and I'm drawing the lines with a little more weight and a little more directness and a little more detail to what I'm doing. So now I put these roof lines in and the chimneys. These are the sorts of details that are really important to include in architecture of this period. And the little chimney pots are always great to put in. Now I get closer to street level. I a little more work on this hedge here and align this first head and then one of 3 backpackers who are walking down the street. I really like the way these backpackers almost invite us to follow them down the street. They're a great invitation to go into the scene, and it's great to be able to use figures for this purpose. It's always great to work at being able to include figures in the streetscape, even if figures aren't a strong point. So now I've got to make some commitments to this jumble at street level. And it's also important to put the cars in at this point. Now, I find cars are one of the most important things where it's important to draw the shapes and not to try and draw a car. It's not uncommon to see rather awkward looking cars in drawings. And it's because we have these set ideas of what a car looks like, usually seeing them front on or side on, when usually in life we see them from some sort of 3/4 view. And that stops us actually seeing what's really there, and we draw what we think we've seen from some half-remembered image of a car. So really important to not think of a car, think of shapes and align the shapes where the cars start and finish, how high they go with other objects that we've already drawn. Now we're moving further back in our plane here, and I've switched to a 0.3mm fine liner. I find that using a finer line further back firstly helps me draw with a lighter touch, which I want, and also gives the impression that this building is a little bit further away across this side street than the ones I've drawn already. So I keep working here. Now I learned from my mistake, and I'm drawing the side of the building, and then I fit the windows into that space just to try and keep it all a bit tighter than I did before. Now these windows are quite some way away, and so I really want to draw them with a much lighter touch, less detail than the ones I've drawn closer. A few more chimneys down here. And now I'm going to do the buildings right down the end of the street, and so I'm switching to a 0.2mm pen. And if you notice, I align these buildings I'm drawing now, not with the buildings closest to them, but with the first buildings I drew. I find that by doing this, it sidesteps any error creep that's happened as I've gone across the page and lets me see exactly where it should be. And if it doesn't really fit there because I have made mistakes, that lets me at least spread the error, make some adjustments to bring the drawing more back into scale. Now I've gone back here now to my 0.5mm pen for this building on the right, which is actually closer than the buildings that you can see drawn on the left, because the very closest buildings on the left hand side are actually in a straight line to us, and so we just see the edge of the corner. We don't see any of the closest streetscape facades. So I deliberately use a bit of a heavier line and show a little more detail in these windows, and then establish that car and street level. And I want to get these three little figures there because they're very important for scale. They relate to the closer three figures to help just give a sense of distance between this point and that point. And then I just finished the details with my 0.3mm pen and the 0.2. Now I come to the bit I've been looking forward to, which is the castle on the top of the hill. Now I've switched to a 0.1mm, which I really don't like drawing with. I feel like I'm just scratching the paper with this. And I think this pen's a bit out of ink as well, but it was just perfect for the very light touch I wanted to get for the castle. I almost want it to be floating above my scene. If it's too heavy, it'll come forward and it's almost like it's balanced on top of the buildings that are closer. We get a sense of distance through all sorts of means in real life, and what we want to do is employ some of them if we can, such as less detail and finer line. So to trick our brain into thinking that these are further away. Now I start, after 30 minutes of drawing, I now start with my sketch markers to splash a bit of tone on. I start with the castle with my two lightest tones, and even though it's in full sunlight, it is a darker colour than the closest stones, and so I use the tone not for shade or shadow but to indicate local colour. And then I put the darker tones on the right hand side closer buildings because they're pretty much the darkest tones of any great size, any great extent, and equally the car in the front and the hedge on the left hand side. Again, the hedge is in sunlight, but I put tone on it to indicate that it's a green colour, a bit of a darker tone than the wall facades. Now there isn't actually a huge amount of shadow or shade in this, but it's quite significant what there is. And so I go back and forth, and I always intend the darkest tones to be in the bottom left corner to sort of anchor our scene, and also to bring our attention to the figures so that we then follow ahead of them and go on the journey with them. And they're a great contrast to the architecture and to all those rows of windows above. It's good to balance various elements in our scene, and certainly the natural elements, the people in this case, with the building structures. The roof, I put some tone on to indicate the local colour, and then it's pretty much done. There's just a few little adjustments that are done, and there are still some adjustments I could do. I think I could go a little bit darker right in that centre distance, down the lower part of the street, right down the bottom. But gosh, where do you stop? So my 30-minute drawing's now, close to 40 minutes to being finished, which I think is a good pace for location sketching. And this is the sort of drawing that's good to do when we can't go and draw on location, to practice. It helps develop the skills that we need of observation, of speed, of just drawing freehand. So this will be on my community page.